New action from Wells Fargo this morning against former executives over that whole fake account fiasco. The bank announcing new salary clawbacks to the tune of about $75 million. For more on this, let's send it over to Wilfred Frost back at HQ with a very special guest. Wilfred.
Sarah, thanks very much. Yes, I'm joined now by the chairman of Wells Fargo, Steve Sanger. Steve, very good morning to you. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me.
So an extensive report has come out today, as Sarah just mentioned. In terms of the individuals, is it fair to say that the headline takeaway is that the former head of the community bank, Kerry Tolstead, has the most to blame?
Well, the root cause of the sales practices issue, as determined by the investigation, was the excessive sales pressure in the community bank, the excessive sales goals, and the failure to escalate the problem appropriately through the structure of the community bank. And Kerry, as the leader of the community bank, is responsible for all that. So certainly that was why she was mentioned so prominently as one of the people involved.
John Stumpf, the former chairman and CEO, faced a lot of criticism too. What was his main shortcoming?
Well, John was not judged to have done anything improper. What John was criticized for, and he would admit this, he acknowledges this, is that he didn't press hard enough on Kerry for information and to address the issue quickly enough. And he didn't change the leadership of the bank quickly enough when that wasn't getting done. And he underestimated the magnitude of the reputation risk that this involved for Wells Fargo. So when the reputation damage occurred as CEO, he's the guy that was in the driver's seat.
He didn't just fail to press Tolstead fast enough. He, in fact, described her at one point as the best banker in the world. How did he get that perspective so wrong?
Well, John had great regard for Kerry Tolstead based on her long tenure there and good performance. And I think what he didn't fully appreciate was the degree to which the sales goals and the sales culture had become distorted in the more recent years.
He was interviewed as part of the process of this investigation, whereas Kerry Tolstead declined to be interviewed on advice of legal counsel. In John Stumpf's interview, did he express outright remorse for his involvement in causing this scandal?
Well, I don't know if remorse would be the right words. He certainly accepted responsibility for his role in the company getting the reputational damage that it did. He acknowledged that there are things he should have done faster and more forcefully, and he's apologized to Wells Fargo's customers for not doing more sooner.
Now, we mentioned that John Stumpf failed to acknowledge and notice the issues in the leadership of the community bank quick enough. That was not something that Tim Sloan failed to do. Once Kerry Tolstead was reporting directly to him when he became president and CEO, as opposed to directly to John Stumpf, it was pretty quick that Tim Sloan decided to remove her and end her tenure. Is that why Tim Sloan comes across in this report as facing significantly less criticism?
Well, Tim had very little direct contact with the sales practice issue at all, by virtue of the fact that he was in the wholesale bank, a totally different part of Wells Fargo. And then after that, or before that, excuse me, it was CFO. So his only direct contact with the community bank was during the brief period when he was chief operating officer and Kerry reported to him. And he made an assessment and quickly decided that he needed to make a change in leadership at the community bank.
As you mentioned, when he was both CFO and head of the wholesale bank, it wasn't his direct responsibility to act based upon the cross-selling issue and scandals, but it was very clear in the report that he was aware of it and that he had heard complaints, for example, of Tolstead long before he acted on that. Could he have been more proactive? Could he have acted in a more forward-looking way and elevated things to the board himself? And are those not the traits you'd like to see in your current CEO?
Well, we have total confidence in Tim Sloan as our current CEO, and I think that's borne out by the actions that he has taken since he became CEO to reorganize the structure of the risk organization and the HR organization so that it is not so decentralized, so things can escalate more quickly. Obviously, he changed the leadership in the community bank. He's brought in a new general counsel. And so the board is quite pleased with the way Tim is leading the change here and leading the organization.
And what about the board itself? I mean, you're of course chairman now, but you've been lead independent director through a large part of this scandal. Do you feel personally responsible for any of it? Well,
the investigation findings concluded that the board acted appropriately based on the information it had at the time that it had it. And this is one of the reasons that we wanted to engage Sherman and Sterling, because the board and I wanted a independent, objective assessment of how the board performed in this instance. And their assessment was that with the information the board got, the board did the right things, but that the board's information was incomplete all the way up until the release of the settlement, at which time the board immediately initiated the investigation.
So we've already said how Carrie Tolstead very clearly was found to do wrongdoing. She was terminated for cause. The board, you're saying, didn't have sufficient information. The only link for most of the period between the two, Carrie Tolstead and the board in terms of reporting lines, was CEO John Stumpf. So how is the punishment for him not more severe, and how is he found not to have acted improperly given those two previous points?
Well, John did not create the sales goals in the community bank. John did not impede the flow of information up through the community bank. John, I think, accepted the reports he was getting that the issue was being handled without enough analysis and perhaps digging into it. But John was responsible for supervising a lot of different leaders in the company. And so he relied too heavily on what he was learning from the community bank, but that's a supervision issue and not a improper behavior issue.
Well, okay, but to put it another way, he became aware of this from 2012, at least, perhaps even earlier, and in the last 6 years, he's received $286 million in total pay. He's given up 69 of that recently, which is just 24%. It feels like a pretty small amount in total, given how closely linked he was to this whole saga.
Well, $69 million is, I believe, the biggest clawback for any individual in financial services history.
But it's relative, Steve, to $286 million since the scandal started to begin.
Well, let me put some context on John's performance over the years at Wells Fargo. During his 9 years as CEO, the market cap of Wells Fargo grew by $110 billion. That almost doubled. And so the shareholders benefited greatly from John Stumpf's leadership of the whole organization, all the parts of it, across that tenure. And I think a $69 million clawback, if you will, is a remarkable show of accountability for someone who has created that much value for shareholders.
But of course, many other hundreds and thousands of employees also contributed to that increase in market capitalization. And the report makes it very clear that the thousands of people in and around that you terminated per year over the last 5 years tended to be, quote, lower level employees. Were these employees wronged by the company? Is there grounds for them to be reinstated or to claim compensation?
Well, the employees that were terminated for misconduct. They may have been motivated and were motivated by the pressure that the community bank organization created to achieve sales goals. But there were hundreds of thousands of other community bank employees who didn't engage in misconduct over that same period of time, who felt some of the same pressure. So we definitely had a need to address the root cause of the people, of the improper behavior. But at the same time, we have to acknowledge all the Wells Fargo employees who behaved correctly during that period of time.
Sure, and I have no doubt many thousands behaved correctly, but let me just find some examples. The monthly motivator reports, your report says some people lived and died by those results, that the jump into January sales campaign, quote, was a breeding ground for bad behavior. Many people say that Tolstead, quote, was scared to death to take these things away because it could hurt the sales figures. Clearly, you had fired many people, 5 people in total, for cause because they were forcing these types of actions on lower level employees. Thousands of employees have lost their jobs per month, and yet John Stumpf still receives 76% of his $286 million over the last 6 years. You can see that there's a disconnect there in terms of the actions you're taking.
Well, I think the actions that the board has taken, including a total of 180 million plus in forfeiture of compensation, are the greatest in any history of financial services. So I think the accountability is clearly being expressed.
In terms of just moving around the sort of root causes again of this whole issue, it was clear that the power structure was too decentralized. And I wonder, therefore, whether the acquisitions of Wachovia and the merger with Norwest were part to blame with this issue.
I don't think the size or the acquisitions are really at the heart of the issue. I think it was structure. The decentralized model, which caused information about risk, information about human resources to flow up to the heads of the businesses, caused the issues like this not to be visible to senior corporate management. And we've changed that. We now have a centralized risk organization. We have a centralized human resource organization. We have an Office of Ethics, Integrity, and Oversight that is specifically tasked with dealing with employee conduct issues and escalating those, including to the board on a regular basis, at least twice a year. So I think we've addressed the main core issues of structure that led to this problem.
Steve, forgive me for going back to Pages one final time. At the start of 2016, John Stumpf exercised a large number of options before the whole sales scandal was made public. Would you have been able to claim back more money from him had he not done that?
We chose to claim back an amount from John that we thought was appropriate to represent accountability for his role as the CEO in the sales practices issue. And so, I mean, we could have chosen various sources of that, but what we chose to ask John to forfeit was what we thought was appropriate given his role.
So you could have done more than the 28 million you've done today if you wanted?
Well, yes, you could. The corporation could take more or less from the executives. We did what the board thought was appropriate.
Steve, we've got a question from the studio from Sarah.
Hey, Sarah.
No.
Not Sarah.
Maybe we don't. Let me just wait and see if they are coming for a question. It sounds like they're not. Steve, just to round things off then, in terms of the culture, clearly culture also had a big issue in this. How do you solve, and how quickly can you solve an issue like culture? Do you feel like the worst is behind you, or there's a lot of work still to done?
Well, yeah. First of all, I'd say there are a lot of things to like about Wells Fargo's culture. Wells Fargo's credit culture, for example, is known to be tremendously good and conservative, and that's how the company got through the financial services scandal in such good shape. So it's not a corporate-wide culture that we're really dealing with. It was a culture of sales orientation, excessive sales orientation in the community bank. And how do you change that? Well, first you change the leadership, which we've done. Second, you change the compensation system, which has been done. And then third, you change structure, which causes issues to be reported much more quickly to senior management, which has also been done. So I think we'll measure the culture. We're not going to say, okay, this is done. We will monitor, measure, and make sure that, in fact, we've achieved what we want to achieve.
Steve, thank you very much for your time. We appreciate it this morning. Steve Sanger, chairman of Wells Fargo. Guys, I'll send it back to the New York Stock Exchange.